Have you ever wondered how life's deepest struggles shape who we become? What happens when we're forced to confront painful truths about ourselves, our relationships, and the ones we love? In today's video, we're diving into a powerful story of self-realization, family dynamics, and emotional resilience that will make you rethink everything you've been taught about love, loyalty, and independence. Why should you watch until the end? Because this story isn't just about one woman's experience. It's a reflection of universal truths that we all face as we navigate relationships and aging. You'll uncover why relying on others can sometimes lead to disappointment, and why learning to stand on your own is the key to true happiness and peace of mind in later life. Plus, we'll explore the quiet strength of those who endure hardship without shedding a tear, revealing what it means to carry on despite life's challenges. This video isn't just for those who've been through tough family dynamics, but for anyone seeking deeper insight into human resilience and the quiet power of self-reliance. Stick with us to discover how we can learn from the pain of others, embrace solitude, and take control of our destinies, regardless of the circumstances. You don't want to miss the life-changing lessons embedded in this heartfelt story. Let's begin. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. If you like the topic of this video, please comment 1. If you don't, please comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make better videos for you. Now, let's begin. The children of today seem so far removed from the values we once held so dear. It fills my heart with a deep, aching sorrow to witness this shift, and to see how the very essence of family, respect, and care for the elderly has crumbled in the face of the relentless pursuit of wealth, status, and fleeting pleasures. I watch as our children, so caught up in the glittering lights of ambition and desire, forget the simple yet profound truths that once guided our lives. It is heartbreaking to realize that in the world we live in today, the currency that defines our worth in old age is not love, not honor, but money. The cruel reality is that, as long as we have wealth, we can still command respect, enjoy companionship, and even receive affection from our children. But the moment that money vanishes, the truth becomes undeniable and harsh. The comfort of love is replaced by silence, and the warmth of family is replaced by cold indifference. It is a painful awakening that many of us face, and I ask you, dear viewers, to reflect on these truths as we journey through these stories of aging and family. Story 1. 74 years old, with 4 children, but none want to support him. This is the story shared by Mr. Nguyen, a man whose tale is a mirror to many others in our society today. He is 74 years old, living his retirement in a nursing home after his wife passed away 2 years ago. Together, they raised 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. For many years, they poured their hearts into raising their children, dreaming of a peaceful old age surrounded by family. They hoped that their hard work and their sacrifices would one day be repaid with love and care from their children in their later years. But, as so often happens, reality is crueler than expectations. After their youngest daughter got married, Mr. Nguyen and his wife found themselves alone, but at that time, they still had work to fill the empty spaces of their lives. It wasn't until they reached their retirement that the true loneliness began to creep in. Their children were busy with their own lives, raising their own families, and the visits grew fewer and farther between. It was painful for them, though they understood the pressures their children faced. It still hurt deeply to realize that their once close bond had faded into the background of their children's busy lives. No phone calls, no visits, just silence. The emptiness was overwhelming, and I could feel the weight of that ache as I reflected on his words. My heart goes out to Mr. Nguyen and his wife, who, despite the pain, still tried to fill their days with activity. They went to the health club, joined neighborhood events, and tried their best to keep busy. They had their pensions, enough to get by, but what is money when you lack the warmth of family? When his wife became ill and passed away, Mr. Nguyen was left shattered, both emotionally and physically. Losing the person you've spent your entire life with is a grief no one can prepare for. During this dark time, his children came to visit, and at first, there was a glimmer of hope. They talked about who would take him in, each of them worried about the loneliness he would face. But in the end, none of them stepped forward. One by one, they gave their reasons. The house was too small, finances were tight, and there wasn't enough time. Each reason sounded more like an excuse than a solution. Even his youngest daughter, who had always been the kindest to him, refused, saying that her husband wasn't comfortable with the idea of having him live with them. I can only imagine how Mr. Nguyen felt at that moment. A father, a man who had dedicated his life to his children, now realizing that his years of sacrifice had not led to the love and care he expected in his final years. How could he not feel betrayed, abandoned? It's a hard truth to swallow, that in old age, the love of your children may not be enough to shield you from loneliness or neglect. But instead of surrendering to despair, Mr. Nguyen decided to take control of his future. He looked at the pension his wife and he had saved, realizing that while it wasn't a fortune, it was enough to support him for a while. He understood that in old age, health can decline quickly and unexpectedly. What happens if he falls ill if he can no longer care for himself? Who would be there for him then? It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he decided he could no longer depend on his children. They were not the safety net he had hoped for. He began to make plans. He would sell the house they had lived in and use the money to pay for a nursing home or hire a caregiver. When he told his children of his plan, none of them supported him. They didn't want the house sold. They didn't want the proceeds used for his care. They promised to visit more often, but none of them offered to take him in. It became glaringly clear to Mr. Nguyen that what mattered to his children was not him, but the house, the inheritance. And that is the true tragedy here. Not only was he abandoned by his children, but it was the realization that they were only interested in what he could leave behind, not what he could offer in his final years. His story, and the stories of so many others, make me reflect deeply on the nature of family and aging in today's world. Are we, as a society, forgetting the true essence of love and responsibility? Do we now see money, inheritance, and possessions as the true ties that bind us, rather than the deep, enduring connections of care, respect, and empathy? For me, this is a wake-up call. A harsh reality check that we must all face. Family, love, and care cannot be bought. But in this world, they are becoming increasingly rare, and that is something that should fill us all with a deep, aching sadness. It is time to reflect on how we want to be treated when we are older. And it is time to make sure we pass on to future generations not just material wealth, but the true values that make life worth living. In the end, I realized that I couldn't rely on anyone else but myself. The weight of that truth was heavy, but it was something I had to face head-on. I sold my house for nearly 7 billion VND, a lifetime of memories wrapped up in those walls, but I knew I had to let go. I moved into a nursing home, a place I had once feared would be the end of my independence. But surprisingly, it wasn't. It wasn't the dull, lonely existence I had imagined. I was taken care of, not just physically, but emotionally too. I found myself surrounded by people who, like me, had come to terms with the reality of aging. In their company, I discovered new friendships, shared stories, and found a sense of belonging that I hadn't expected. My children, of course, didn't understand. Relatives criticized them for sending me to the nursing home, calling them heartless, but I could see the guilt eating away at them. It wasn't long before they began visiting more regularly, trying to make up for their perceived wrongs. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But through all of this, I came to an epiphany. As long as I had money, enough to live on comfortably in my later years, I didn't need to depend on anyone, not even my children. The freedom that came with this realization was liberating. No longer did I feel like I was at the mercy of others' decisions or expectations. No matter where I lived, as long as I had my financial independence, I could still hold the reins of my own life. And that was enough for me. It gave me peace. The location, the house, none of it mattered. What mattered most was the ability to remain in control of my destiny in my twilight years. That alone made everything feel lighter and easier to bear. Aunt Luke's story was one I could relate to on so many levels. She had never imagined things would turn out this way, never expected that the decisions she made with love and sacrifice would come back to hurt her so deeply. When her son got married and had children, he convinced her that their old house in the countryside was no longer suitable for raising a family. He said the children needed to grow up in a bigger, more modern environment. So, after much emotional turmoil and hesitation, Aunt Luke agreed to sell the only thing of value she had left, the home she and her late husband had inherited from their ancestors. It wasn't just a house, it was a legacy, a piece of their past, their history. But her son and daughter-in-law were persistent, and after long discussions, she gave in. Aunt Luke, wanting the best for her grandchildren, handed over nearly 1.6 billion VND from the sale to help her son buy a new house. They ended up purchasing a small, modest house in the city, one that was even smaller than the old countryside home. The family's financial situation was tighter than she had anticipated. Her son still had debts to pay, and life in the city didn't offer the relief she had hoped for. But Aunt Luke didn't mind. She loved her children so much that every month, when her pension came, she gave it all to them, leaving herself with nothing. She convinced herself she didn't need anything, that her children's needs came first. She was determined to never be a burden to them, to offer them whatever she could, even if it meant sacrificing her well-being. She believed that when the time came, they would take care of her, and she wouldn't have to worry about being alone. But as time passed, she began to see the painful truth. Her children were pushing her away, even after all she had given. When Aunt Luke moved in with her son, she found herself doing all the things she had always done, caring for the grandchildren while her son and daughter-in-law worked. But as her health started to decline, her body grew weaker, and the pain in her joints became unbearable. She knew it was time to let go of some responsibilities. She asked her son to start taking over, to let the children start taking care of themselves. Instead of understanding, he snapped at her. He said she couldn't even care for the kids properly anymore. That moment shattered her. How could her son, the one she had given everything for, turn on her like that? Without a second thought, the couple decided they no longer wanted her around. They coldly told her to move out and rent a place on her own. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. She had sacrificed everything, and now she was being discarded like an unwanted possession. Her pain didn't end there. After leaving her son's home, she went to her daughter's, hoping for a bit of solace. But her daughter's response was even more heart-wrenching. "You sold the house to your son and daughter-in-law," her daughter said, "and we didn't get anything. Why don't you live with them? Why come back to us?" Aunt Luke was stunned, her heart breaking into pieces. How could her children, the ones she had raised and loved unconditionally, turn their backs on her? The loneliness, the rejection, it was more than she could bear. But she didn't give up. She found a small room to rent, and thankfully, her pension still allowed her to live without needing to rely on anyone. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her dignity intact. In the end, Aunt Luke learned the painful truth. When it comes to old age, you can't count on anyone but yourself. Her story left me with a deep sense of sorrow, but also a realization. No matter how much we love our children, no matter how much we sacrifice for them, in the end, we are the only ones who can truly care for ourselves. The world may change, and relationships may falter, but our independence is something no one can take from us, as long as we fight for it. Lying alone in her rented room, Aunt Luke found herself reflecting deeply, her mind wandering to the many things she had never truly understood before. In that quiet solitude, she realized something that was both simple and profound. Even if you choose to live for others, you must always leave a way out for yourself. For a long time, she had lived her life entirely for those around her. Her family, her friends, her children. and had neglected her own needs, her desires. But now, in the stillness of her room, she understood the painful truth. If you sacrifice everything for others and forget to care for your soul, one day you will find yourself lost, weary, and regretful, with no way to turn back. The life you give to others is not guaranteed to be reciprocated, and you may end up forgotten and empty, unable to fill the void that remains. There's another story that lingers in her mind, one that still makes her heart ache. It's about a retired man, a man who once earned over 33 million VND every month, yet kept that secret buried deep. When he told his son that he only received 10 million VND in pension, it wasn't just a fib. It was a heartbreaking silence, a quiet confession of the painful reality of their relationship. The son, unaware of the wealth his father had accumulated, had no idea that his father was doing so well, and the father, in turn, had no idea how much his son's heart longed for him. It was a painful truth that would change everything. The father's contentment in his son's love was more fulfilling than any amount of money. Before retirement, this man had been a workaholic, unable to sit still for a moment, always racing against time. But when an old friend opened a business and asked him to consult, offering him a comfortable salary of 33 million VND per month, he couldn't resist. It was a simple job, one that required no real effort, just the wisdom and experience he had accumulated over the years. The money flowed in, alongside his pension, and soon his wife and he were able to live comfortably, independent of their children. They had saved enough to support themselves, to cherish their freedom. And yet, even though they had everything, the man wrestled with the temptation to share his good fortune. He wanted to boast, to tell his friends and neighbors of his success, to bask in the admiration that might follow. But his wife, wise beyond measure, urged him to remain quiet. She told him that financial matters should be kept private. Keeping such things hidden would protect them from the deceit and manipulation that so often accompany wealth. The man, initially reluctant, understood. He agreed that privacy was the best course of action, and he decided not to share the details of their newfound prosperity with anyone. But there was one person he wanted to confide in: his son. The man had watched his son struggle, weighed down by loans and the pressures of his own life. The father wanted to help, to ease his son's burden, but his wife, ever steadfast in her beliefs, refused. She felt it was better for them to remain self-sufficient, even if it meant not helping their children. The man wrestled with her words, but eventually saw the wisdom in her view. He kept quiet. Then, during a visit, the son asked about the father's pension, and for the first time, the father felt a deep sense of unease. He didn't know how to respond. His wife, ever protective, quickly intervened and told their son that the pension was only about 10 million VND. The father, feeling a pang of guilt, could only offer an awkward smile and avoid his son's gaze. The conversation quickly shifted, and time passed, but the awkwardness lingered in the father's heart. It wasn't until the Lunar New Year, when the son's family didn't come to visit, that the full weight of it all hit him. In the past, no matter how busy life had been, the son had always made time to visit, to share the joy of the season. But this year, nothing. Not even a call. The father's heart ached as he lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, wondering where he had gone wrong. His wife comforted him, assuring him that the son was probably just too busy. Still, the father could not shake the feeling that there was something more, something unspoken, that had caused the rift. Unable to bear the distance, the father decided to visit his son. He sent a message, and the son agreed to meet him. When he arrived at his son's house, something hit him harder than anything else. After stepping off the bus, he called his son to pick him up, but his son said he was busy. The father and mother, too hot to wait, took a motorbike taxi to their son's home. And when they arrived, the sight that greeted them left the father with a hollow feeling. His daughter-in-law was sprawled on the sofa, lazily watching TV, and his son didn't even acknowledge their presence. The only warmth came from his grandson, who greeted them with a kind smile, pouring tea and taking their bags. It was a bittersweet moment, the sharp sting of indifference settling in the pit of his stomach. He had spent his life working for his family, sacrificing so much for their future, yet in the end, it was his grandson who showed him the most care. The contrast between the love he had given and the coldness he now received was a painful reality that he could no longer ignore. It was then that Aunt Luke, in her solitude, fully understood. The truth is, no matter how much you give, no matter how much you sacrifice, there will always be moments when you feel utterly alone. The love you give may not be returned the way you imagine, and the relationships you've built may not be as strong as you thought. It is a hard lesson to learn, but one that teaches us the value of self-care, self-love, and the importance of not losing ourselves in the pursuit of others' happiness. All day long at my son's house, I couldn't shake the sense of cold indifference that hung between us. It was as though my husband and I were invisible, just there in the background, with no real place in the family's life. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt, until I was finally struck by a comment that hit me like a slap to the face. My son said, "If you're not willing to help us, don't expect anything from us in the future." Those words weren't just harsh, they felt like a betrayal. I couldn't believe it. Anger surged through me, but more than that, my heart shattered. I had always believed that family was built on mutual care and respect, but in that moment, it felt as if I was nothing more than a burden to them. The next morning, my husband and I decided we'd had enough. We packed our bags and left their house. I won't lie, it was hard to walk out the door. At first, a part of me wondered if we had done something wrong by not helping them. Maybe we had been selfish. But as I sat there on the drive home, I realized something that I hadn't fully grasped before. My husband was right. It wasn't just about the help. It was about respect, and more than that, it was about seeing through the illusion of familial duty. For the first time, I saw my children's true colors, and it left me reeling. Yes, it's natural for parents to care for their children, but expecting that same care to be returned as you grow older is something different altogether. I had foolishly believed that their kindness towards me was rooted in filial piety, in the idea that they owed me something for raising them. But now I see that wasn't the case. If anything, it was a quiet transaction in their eyes. Help us, and we'll help you in return. But what if you don't have anything to give? The realization was painful, but it opened my eyes to a hard truth. I can't rely on them anymore. Fortunately, my husband and I have a savings fund, so at least financially we are secure. But I also know now that it's not enough to just be financially secure. What matters is that we are the ones who must decide how we want to live our lives. It is up to us, not anyone else. The truth is, no one can be trusted with your future more than yourself. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. Relying on ourselves isn't just a practical choice, it's the only choice. As I reflect on all of this, I'm reminded of something that's been on my mind lately. It's a story I want to share with you today, a story that has always stuck with me. My mother didn't cry. I remember the day so clearly. I came home from school and saw a man sitting hunched over in a wicker chair, his face lost in thought. He was wearing a simple brown khaki shirt, his clothes gently swaying in the breeze. He looked so out of place, like a man whose spirit had been drained away. On the other side of the room, my mother sat silently, fanning herself with a bamboo fan. Her face was flushed with heat, and sweat trickled slowly down her neck, glistening as it fell. But it was her eyes that spoke the loudest. They were red and distant, as if she were staring straight through the man and the room, into some other place far away. She looked like she was lost, not in the sense of confusion, but in the quiet surrender of years gone by. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. This man, he was over 40, I'd guess, had a face that was weathered, as though time had taken a toll that no one could undo. His body was thin, his skin rough, as if the years had left their mark in more ways than one. His eyes, though, were the saddest part, empty, devoid of life, yet full of memories he couldn't recall. I remember putting my school bag down on the table, and my mother giving me a quiet signal to stay still, so he could rest. She gently led me behind the house, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's strange, isn't he?" The words weren't meant for me, nor were they meant for him. It was like a confession to the air itself, a confession of the years of loneliness that had settled into her bones. She told me his name was a name she gave him, hoping it would bring him peace. He had no memory of his past, no sense of where he had come from, or if he even had a family. Something had happened to him, a trauma so deep that it erased all traces of his former self. My mother spoke softly about him, not with pity, but with something else. Perhaps understanding, perhaps sorrow. She hoped his life would find calm here. But I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness for him. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't shake. It was like he had been abandoned by life itself. As I grew older, I would ask her, "Where is Dad?" And she would always answer in the same way, her voice steady but distant. "Your dad is meeting the dawn. He'll come back to lay a tile. He's been gone for over 10 years now, and no one has seen him since." I never fully understood the meaning behind her words until much later, but I came to learn that my father, along with other men from the village, had gone out to sea to fish. A storm hit, and while the others made it back, my father drowned, unable to swim. When people asked why he hadn't learned to swim, he'd just laugh and say, "I'd rather drown than starve." At that moment, I think he had chosen the lesser of two fears. The fear of drowning seemed more peaceful, more merciful than the slow, gnawing hunger that would have come with survival. After the storm, the fishermen who survived returned on boats sent by the border guards. The villagers waited at the beach, hoping for any news, but the air was filled only with the sound of crashing waves, the wind howling, and the cries of those who had lost their loved ones. But my mother stood alone on the shore, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the sea, watching the waves that seemed to stretch on forever. She never shed a tear. People said that she was heartless. How could she not cry for her husband? But my mother simply sighed, her gaze distant. "When someone dies," she said quietly, "they must be seen off." And in those words, I understood something about her. She had carried the weight of my father's death for years, and though the emptiness in her heart never fully healed, she had learned to live with it. Her eyes never faltered as she looked at the sunlight filtering through the roof, a small gap that couldn't be covered. I think, in that moment, she realized that some things can never be fixed, no matter how hard we try. Some losses are just too great. There's a story about my mother that few people know, one that carries a weight I can never quite shake off. When she was born, my grandmother said my mother didn't cry, not a single sound, not even a tiny whimper. Her first cry was so faint, so fragile, that neither my grandmother nor the midwife were sure they'd even heard it. From that moment, my grandmother predicted my mother's life would be a quiet, stoic one, devoid of the tears and warmth that many others take for granted. As she grew, that prediction seemed to shape her entirely. My mother never cried, not when my grandmother hit her, not when she lost her first love, and not even when my grandmother herself passed away. At the funeral, my mother stood there, her face as still as stone, her eyes dry. People in the village often whispered that she was cold-hearted, that something was missing in her. But I knew better. I knew that my mother had built walls around her heart, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep, internal emptiness she had learned to live with. It's a kind of emptiness that doesn't show but eats away at you from the inside. Sometimes, I think about that emptiness and wonder if it's something I inherited. After all, I know my mother's silence. I know how she never showed vulnerability, and never allowed herself the luxury of crying, even when life would have crushed most others. I wonder how many tears she must have swallowed, how many heartbreaks she carried in the depths of her chest without ever letting them surface. And yet, I also wonder how much of it was a defense, a shield she built against a world that had hurt her. But there's a part of me that resents her for it, too. For years, I tried to break through that silence, to understand her pain, but I could never reach her. I only felt the distance between us grow, like a chasm I couldn't cross. And now, as I look back, I realize that part of me still feels that same rage. Maybe it's the rage of a child who couldn't be understood, the kind of anger that festers when you're told that everything will be fine, even though your world is falling apart. One day, those feelings of betrayal and anger came flooding back, triggered by something that I should have known better than to let affect me. A voice, so cold and malicious, came from nowhere, and in that moment, I believed every word. It was like someone had thrown gasoline on a fire that had been simmering for years. I was ready for the explosion. I was ready to make my move. But then something happened that I didn't expect. I looked up and saw him. This man who had somehow slipped into our lives, so quietly, so patiently. He handed me something soft, wrinkled, fragile. At first, I didn't know what it was, but after a moment of hesitation, I realized it was a paper crane made from old newspapers. I didn't want to take it. I told myself it was meaningless, just a silly gesture that meant nothing. But as I looked at him, standing there with his hands cupped so carefully, offering it like a fragile gift, I couldn't help myself. I took it. In that moment, I felt something shift within me, like I was in the presence of something real, something raw. But then I tore it up, in front of him, and threw it into the stove. I watched as it burned, the small flames curling around the scraps of paper. He said nothing. He didn't even flinch. He just left. When he came into our house, everything seemed to change, though not in any way I expected. The chair that had been wobbly for months finally became steady, and the gap in the roof that my father promised to fix was sealed. There was a strange sense of stability in his presence, a calm that I hadn't realized I was missing. But it wasn't enough. It never was enough. There was still a part of me that couldn't accept him, that couldn't allow myself to feel any real connection to him. He was just another person in a long line of people who came and went, but I knew deep down that I had no right to be angry with him. He was just a simple, naive man, one who believed in things I didn't. But I couldn't bring myself to care. I just waited for the right moment to push him away, to send him packing. And that moment came when my mother went to the village next door. She had a memorial meal to attend, and I saw my chance. I started to be kind to him, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that I didn't have a plan. I felt sick to my stomach for manipulating someone who didn't deserve it, but I couldn't stop myself. He was so trusting, so unaware, and it made me feel powerful and in control for the first time in a long time. I convinced him to go with me to the market, and for the first time, I sat behind him on his bicycle. His broad back offered me the kind of shelter I had never known. I felt, for a fleeting moment, as though I could rest, as though I could trust him. It was the strangest feeling, peace, for once. But I pushed it away. I couldn't afford to feel anything. I had a mission. At the market, I told him to stay and wait. I took the bicycle inside, and then quickly slipped out the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran home, feeling the weight of my actions lift from me with each step. I could only hope that he'd be confused, lost, and unable to find his way back. I didn't care anymore. I was free. But, in a cruel twist of fate, the miracle I had hoped for came that very night. As I sat alone on the porch, desperately trying to escape the weight of my mother's worried gaze, her eyes filled with a kind of anxious love that only a mother can know, I couldn't help but feel the suffocating tension in the air. He had vanished so suddenly, leaving without even a word of farewell, and that silence between us seemed to stretch endlessly. It was a silence that gnawed at me, eating away at any peace I might have had. I couldn't bear to face the expression on my mother's face when she spoke of him, that deep, hollow ache in her voice as she wondered where he had gone, why he had left without a trace. It was unbearable. I had convinced myself that I could just move past it, but the guilt, the heavy guilt that came from not knowing how to fix this, clung to me like a shadow. Then, one afternoon, when the air felt particularly thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts, I saw him. He appeared so suddenly, standing there before me like a ghost from the past, as though he'd never truly been gone. For a moment, I felt my heart stop, my breath catch in my throat. He looked exactly as he had the first time we met. Tall, calm, steady. But his eyes, they were different. There was a quiet emptiness in them, a stillness so deep it made my skin crawl. He didn't speak. He didn't say a single word, no accusations, no questions. Just silence. But it was not the same silence I had once known. It was heavy, like it carried the weight of everything we had never said, everything we had never resolved. That silence, that oppressive quiet, was enough to bury my guilt for a fleeting moment. Yet it would come back to haunt me, lingering like a bitter aftertaste I couldn't wash away. I knew in that moment that the guilt I felt wouldn't just fade away with time. No, it would follow me, cling to me, perhaps for the rest of my life. In the months that followed, I watched from a distance as he became an integral part of our lives, though it was never quite spoken aloud. He began accompanying my mother to the beach, rising before the sun, as though following some quiet ritual. They would wait together for the fishing boats to return, their nets filled with the spoils of the sea, shrimp, fish, treasures left behind by the tides. They'd collect whatever the sea offered as if it were a simple, almost sacred act. Sometimes, they'd walk the shoreline in search of sea snails, their footprints trailing behind them in the sand, leaving behind little traces of their existence. I couldn't deny the image of them, side by side, was beautiful. They moved in harmony, like two figures in a painting, silent, serene, content. And the village, over time, had come to accept him as part of the landscape, as inevitable as the rising sun, as if fate had woven them together in ways that no one could deny. I wonder now, with the clarity of hindsight, if I should call what they shared a kind of fateful love story. There was something in the way my mother looked at him, something beyond mere companionship, something deeper. She needed him, I could see that, though I couldn't understand it fully at the time. It wasn't a love story I had ever imagined for her, nor one I had ever wanted. But it was undeniably there, woven into the quiet moments they shared, into the unspoken bond they had formed. It was a bond that defied easy explanation, but one that I could see was incredibly strong, like a thread that held them together through something neither of them could truly name. And then came the day when they shared a room. I remember that moment so clearly, almost too clearly. I accepted it, or at least, I thought I did. I didn't argue, didn't voice my anger, didn't ask questions. But inside, there was a storm brewing, a storm that I couldn't fully acknowledge. The truth was, I hated the thought of him, this stranger who had become so familiar, taking my father's place. Even though I had never known my father, not even from a photograph, he was still mine, the only one I had. It felt like a betrayal, not just of me, but of the memory of a man I never knew but had always held in a sacred place in my heart. My mother never spoke of my father, but I could feel his absence, a void that he left in her heart. And now, this man, who had become a part of our daily rhythm, was occupying space that once belonged only to him. Their relationship was never made public, not in any grand way, but it didn't need to be. You could see it in the way they looked at each other. The small, secret smiles, the gentle touches, the shared moments of quiet understanding. He had become the man of the house in a way that I hadn't been prepared for. And my mother, beside him, looked more like a wife than I had ever imagined she could be. It was a picture of domesticity that I didn't quite fit into, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't find my place in that image of happiness. It was a family, but not mine. Recently, he had begun to accompany the fishing boats on their long journeys out to sea. My mother's new worry, the one that kept her up at night, was whether the boat with him aboard would return safely at dawn. It wasn't just the worry of the sea. It was the worry of losing him, as if the ocean could claim him the way it sometimes claimed those who ventured too far. The trips were long, sometimes lasting weeks. The men would return, their boats loaded with fish, their faces shining with the pride of a successful voyage. And when he came back, he always had a gift for me: coral, seashells, sand, sometimes even a starfish he had found in the nets, or something I had casually mentioned wanting. At first, I didn't want these trinkets. They felt like small gestures, as if he were trying to win me over, to make up for something I couldn't name. I didn't want gifts. I wanted answers and closure, but most of all, I wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me. Yet, despite my bitterness, he always offered those gifts with kindness, an affection that left me speechless. And in those moments, when I held the coral or the shells in my hands, I realized that I could never truly despise him, not the way I wanted to. Because there was something in the way he gave those things, something that made me wonder if I could ever understand the bond my mother had with him. Something deeper than I could see, something that, despite everything, touched me in ways I couldn't yet grasp. One ordinary day, everything changed. I was walking past my mother's room, the door slightly open, when I overheard a conversation that shattered my world. My mother, with an almost bashful tone, confessed that she was pregnant. Pregnant. I was going to have a sibling. The moment those words reached my ears, it felt like time stopped. A cold wave of disbelief washed over me, and I felt as if my entire body had frozen. My heart dropped into my stomach, and an overwhelming sense of loss and abandonment gripped me. I had always thought I was her everything, her center, her reason for being. But now I was just being pushed out, made redundant in the most painful way imaginable. I could hardly breathe as the reality of it sank in. My mind screamed, and my emotions twisted into something dark and suffocating. The anger. Oh, the anger was like fire, burning through every fiber of my being. I wanted to lash out, to make him pay for taking my place. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. The day was bleak. It was late afternoon, the very end of the month, and winter was just beginning to creep in. The air felt thick and oppressive, and the sky seemed to hang heavy with dark rain clouds. The wind, if there was any, felt trapped, unable to move, like it, too, was suffocating. The atmosphere was stifling, like the entire world was holding its breath. And there I was, caught in my storm of emotions, as I pushed open that door. And there he was, this man I despised, holding a large iron rod, a symbol of control, of his dominance. He was so meticulous, so precise in his actions. The sight of him, the way he arranged everything, his calm, perfect order, it made my skin crawl. At that moment, I knew something had to change. I plotted my revenge. When he returned from his trip to sea, I wanted him to see that all the things he had worked so hard to preserve, everything he valued, had been reduced to chaos. The thought of it brought a sick satisfaction, so overwhelming that I almost laughed aloud in my fury. My heart raced with each step I took, as I began my plan of destruction. I ripped the wind chimes from the window with more force than I had ever known I could muster. I smashed them with the iron rod, the sound ringing in my ears like a sweet melody of vengeance. I knocked over the small flower pots, watching as they tumbled to the ground, their contents spilling everywhere. I threw everything, all his little treasures, his belongings, onto the floor. But then, as the wind picked up, something fell from a dark green military bag. A small notebook, its pages flapping in the breeze, caught my eye. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a journal, and as I flipped through the pages, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. His handwriting was crude, uneven, and almost childish, but what shocked me the most was what it contained. Every detail about me, every little interaction, every moment, even the ones I had long forgotten. The first time I saw him sleeping on the couch, the meals I had ignored, the paper crane he gave me that I had burned, the time I ran away from him in the market, leaving him behind. It was all there, laid out for me to see as if he had been keeping track of me. But what struck me the most wasn't the detail. It was the fact that not once, in all those pages, did he ever express bitterness or anger toward me. No, there was only one word, sorry. He never blamed me. He forgave me over and over again, as though he had no right to feel hurt. The last entry, written just days ago, was a simple sentence that broke something deep inside me. It read, "I wish the girl could call me Dad." I could hardly breathe as I held that notebook, my heart twisted in 1,000 different directions. I ran, as fast as I could, to the beach. The world felt unreal, like I was moving through a dream. The sky, heavy and oppressive, seemed to lower as I reached the docks. The fishing boats were coming in, and there, standing among the crowd, I saw my mother. She stood out to me, her purple blouse and the scarf draped over her shoulder. She was gazing out at the sea, lost in thought. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I wondered what this all meant for me. As we reflect on this deeply emotional and transformative journey, we realize how much our own experiences, our feelings of being overlooked or displaced, can shape the way we react to the people around us. It's a powerful reminder that our relationships are complex and filled with moments of pain, but also of immense growth. Through this story, we've seen how anger, resentment, and even feelings of betrayal can slowly unravel and make space for understanding, forgiveness, and even change. So, what have you learned from this story? Is there a lesson here that speaks to your own life? Maybe it's the realization that holding onto grudges only weighs us down, or perhaps it's understanding that even in the most painful moments, there's room for healing and growth. Whatever it may be, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please, comment below with one thing you've learned from this story and how you plan to apply it to your own life. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories and life lessons. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us.